Welcome back everyone. Let's go ahead and do a comparison between the iPad Air 5, technically the M1 iPad, and the iPad Air 4 from 2020 and see which specific iPad I guess is the better one. Now I will definitely tell you the iPad Air 5 is the one I would recommend people to buy. I mean, it's the same price as the iPad Air 4 was before, so it really only makes sense to pick up that iPad over the iPad Air 4, but I will tell you, if you own the iPad Air 4, it really doesn't make too much sense to go to the Air 5. I mean, there's really not a crazy amount of difference. I think the Air 5 is a great iPad and I think it has a ton of capability, but I do think something like the iPad Air 4 is pretty much like 95% of what the Air 5 is, to be completely honest. Really the only things I see crazy big difference with the iPad Air 5 is probably with things like the longevity between it. The M1 chipset inside could have more of a potential than the A series of chipsets, but ultimately, I mean, we'll kind of see how they compare. If you want to pick up either one of these iPads, links will be down in the description. You can get them from there and you can help support the channel at the same time. Now on the front of both these iPads, they have the same exact displays. So 10.9-inch panels between both. They're liquid retina IPS panels and they are 1640 by 2360. So the resolution of these panels is actually quite high. They're definitely not like bad resolution panels, or they're not bad panels in general. Really the main difference that I can tell from this panel and the iPad Pro's panel, honestly there's some ways I can kind of tell some bigger differences, to be completely honest, but you're not getting that 120 hertz, and that may end up being one of the bigger differences. Beyond that, it's not this crazy big, ginormous difference you're going to tell between both. I think both these iPads have a lot of capability with the panels, but the front, there's really not that big of a difference, to be completely honest. Now they both have USB Type-C ports on the bottom. They both have Apple Pencil support on the side as well, which is really cool. And on the back, you have this aluminum slab on the back, which looks really good. Both these iPads are kind of the same thing for a couple of years now, so nothing has really changed too much since the 2018 iPad Pros, but they still look very good, and I don't really have too much to complain about it here either. You have the camera set up on the top left corner, and overall, both these iPads feel extremely premium in the hand, and the build quality could not be more similar. There's a couple of different color variations on the iPad Air, but other than that, like I mentioned before, they're way more similar than not. So in terms of the outside, that kind of covers it up there. Now in terms of the camera quality, there's very little overlap here too, or there's a lot of overlap, whichever one is pretty much the better one. On the iPad Air 4, we have a 12 megapixel wide-angle lens on the back, where you have a 7 megapixel front-facing camera. Now on the iPad Air 5, we do have a little bit of an advantage. We have the same exact back camera for the most part, so that same 12 megapixel sensor, but we do have a 12 megapixel front-facing camera that does have that ultra-wide sensor. Now why is that important? Well, not only do we have, the ability of, adding more into the frame of a photo or video if we're doing it, we also can utilize that center stage capability. So there's overlap because they do have, the same video resolutions we can film in, 4K at 60 on the back, 1080p at 60 on the front, but having that additional ultra-wide sensor on the front is actually really cool. And for things like FaceTime calls, and I do think there are some applications that can utilize that ultra-wide sensor as well, it's actually a really cool addition. On top of that, we do have things, like that center stage capability where if we're in a FaceTime call, we can go ahead and move around and basically see, ourselves in that frame even if we're moving around. And I think that's really cool. The iPad Air 4 doesn't have it. Obviously, you can still do things like FaceTime and stuff, but that is a really cool ability we have in the Air 5. Now, on top of that, the camera quality between them is very identical, as I mentioned before. I'm not the one to take photos and videos on an iPad, but I still would say the overlap between these, there's just so much similarity between them. If you're not planning on doing FaceTime calls or anything like that, or if you're planning on doing FaceTime calls and you want that type of capability, well then it's a really good upgrade. I think that's probably going to justify it in and of itself. However, the iPad 9th generation also supports this as well, so you could probably go down to the iPad if you want to, but I still think these iPads have great cameras. I think the iPad Air 5's camera is better, but the Air 4's camera is still really good in my opinion, so that kind of covers it up there. Now, in terms of longevity, this is a very interesting thing between these two iPads, mostly because there really isn't, a blueprint for the M1 iPad that we can follow. I'm going to assume that it's going to outlast the A15 Bionic. I'm going to assume that it's going to outperform the A14 Bionic, but it's been around about the same time as the A14 Bionic that's in the iPad Air 4. So I'm not really too sure, I'm assuming the Air 5 has to outlast the, iPad Air 4. I mean, there's no way the Air 5 is going to not last as long. So is it going to be 1 year, 2 years? There's about a year and a half difference between these two iPads. So I don't know what the future of the iPad Air 5 holds. I can kind of tell you that the Air 4 is probably going to last maybe like 5 years in total. So it may end up with like the iPhone 12s. So that's probably what it's going to end off with. But on the iPad Air 5, I don't know how to call it, typically MacBooks end up lasting a much longer time than you would expect, and if this thing has the same chipset as a MacBook, then how is that going to work? Is it going to last as long as those MacBooks? And I'm assuming the M1 MacBooks are going to last for a very long amount of time. So I guess we'll see what happens in the future, but in terms of longevity, it's kind of tough to tell. I'm going to assume that the iPad Air 5 is going to last longer, but the Air 4 could still last for a very long amount of time as well. So I'll keep you guys updated, in the next couple of years, however that goes. But in terms of longevity, that kind of covers it up there. Now, in terms of performance, this is a very interesting thing between them. The iPad Air 4 has that Apple A14 Bionic chip inside of it with 4GB of RAM, where the iPad Air 5, the M1 iPad, has that Apple M1 chipset inside of it, and it looks like it has 8GB of RAM for maybe the top tier model. I'm not 100% too sure, but from the spec sheet I have, it says that it has 8GB of RAM, which I doubt because I don't think it has twice, but I could be totally wrong. The thing with the performance of these iPads though, is that the iPad Air 4 has a very good, chipset inside of it still. Even though it's a little bit dated compared to the M1 chipset, it is still a very powerful chipset. I've had nothing but a great performance and great time from my iPad Air 4, and I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind. When you have something like the iPad Air 4, you are going to be, getting supported software for a very long amount of time. It's not like this thing is going to be outdated tomorrow, but the performance of this iPad is still top tier. This thing has a lot of capability, and because it doesn't have 120Hz like the M1 iPad Air, you're still going to be, kind of missing out on some things, but it's still a very smooth iPad, and you're not really going to be missing out on too much. With something like the M1 iPad though, it is taking that to the next level. Now, personally, if I wasn't using these things side by side, I probably could not tell that big of a difference. I think I'm kind of used to the M1 chipset in not only the MacBooks, but also in the iPads as well. This is the third iPad that we have with an M1 chipset inside. So I'll definitely tell you this chipset is very powerful. I like it a lot. I am kind of curious to see what's going to be happening with the future of this iPad and seeing if the performance gets better, because whenever an iPad comes out, it's definitely not at its top tier performance. I'll definitely tell you the performance of both these iPads is great. Maybe the iPad Air 5's performance is better, but I generally cannot tell a crazy big amount of difference. And I do believe I think last year, I did a comparison between the M1 iPad Pro and an iPhone 12 or iPhone 13, and the performance was very similar between them as well. So I'll be curious to see what the future of these hold, but I'll probably just say the M1 iPad Air is probably the faster one when it comes down to it. In terms of battery life, I couldn't really tell that big of a difference in the battery life department either. It looks like that the iPad Air 5 has a little bit of a smaller battery size than the iPad Air 4. It looks like the iPad Air 4 had a 28.93 watt hour battery. The iPad Air 5 had a 28.6 watt hour battery. So looks like it's a little bit smaller, but it's nothing crazy, and I don't think most people will pretty much notice that big of a difference when you're using it day to day. So in terms of that kind of covers it up there. And to kind of sum up this whole entire video, if I'm going to be completely honest, I think the iPad Air 4 is still a very good iPad. I think this thing still has a ton of capability within it, and I don't really have too much to complain about. When I have an iPad like the iPad Air 4, this is a very good machine. It has, still so much capability within it. But I do think with something like the M1 iPad, this thing is probably the future, and even if it's not at its full potential here yet, Apple is going to be spending so much money in order to actually just advance this M1 chipset, since so many devices utilize it. And I'm assuming there's a lot of features that are going to be coming out in the future that Apple has specifically, tailored for the M1 chip that the iPad Air 4 may not be able to get. So again, I will be curious to see what happens in the future. Since so many devices support this M1 chipset, I can only see Apple focusing their attention on that M1 chip versus something like the A series of chipsets. So in my opinion, both these iPads are great, but looking at the future of these iPads, there definitely seems to be more of a future with the iPad Air 5 than with the iPad Air 4. So that kind of covers it. If you guys have any questions or anything, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.